Sustain 267.
Welcome to the Sustain 267 feature on Yarona FM. This week is the first week of COP29, which is hosted by Azerbaijan in Baku. And today we're going to be speaking to the lead negotiator on loss and damage for the Africa Group of Negotiators and the co-chair of the Santiago Network Advisory Group, Alpha Kalonga. Alpha, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
All right, I'm going to make it quick because I know you have a negotiation to get to. There's so many things on the agenda. What are our priority items as Africa that we should be keeping an eye on?
This COP is labeled and called a finance COP. It is the ultimate test whether this process makes sense, whether there is a global solidarity, whether country can get more ambitious in their national determined contribution NDCs, which is actually a plan that every country lay out in terms of cutting greenhouse gases, adapting to climate change, and addressing the residual impacts of climate change. So this is going to be very important because at this COP, country agreed in 2015 that from 2025, a new quantitative goal will be set from the floor of 100 billion goal. And we are trying to find the number, and the number is still in the black box. No one knows where the number is. Fact is, for us, from African perspective, we are in a context where many African countries are paying more for servicing steps that they have resources to invest in very basic development sectors like education, like health, at the same time paying a certain percentage of their GDP annually to address urgent needs of vulnerable communities that are affected by climate events. Since we are on the pathway of more than 2 degrees, and developed worlds have already exceeded their carbon budget and using our legitimate budget that remains to stay under the 2 degree, 1.5 degree. The question is whether they will be ready to help us to pay the incremental cost of development that make our resilient and low carbon. So that is what is at stake at this COP.
Given what's at stake, and to counter your question with a question, given the challenges, the stake that Africa is having its budget eaten into, and this is the climate finance COP, what would a successful COP for us look like? If this COP is to be a success, what would we get out of it?
I mean, Africa has been very consistent. This process, it is a process that is an evidence-based process, informed by science, informed by needs expressed by countries. We are not expecting more than that. We need to have a number that is in line with what the science is saying, the projected impact, the required climate actions to curb greenhouse gases, but also what we have in our NDCs, the so-called conditional contributions. In the national determined contribution, there are 2 types of interventions. One being a domestic one that we finance ourselves, and the second subject of international support. So that is what needs to be financed here. So on the other hand, we've been told that there's a global recession and there's no money there. But at the same time, we are saying as far and as long the global north interest is involved, they can mobilize resources. A good example are the war that are happening in the world now. Billions are being provided to Israel, to Ukraine, and billions that exceed the 100 billion goal that developed countries is supposed to be given to all developing countries. And by the way, that goal is not met because there is report available, but a self-reported one does need to be double-checked by a third review. Africa is simply asking at least 1.3 trillions a year for helping developing country to take the pathway that is consistent with the science. That is, the 1.3 is actually less than what we provided in our NCQG, but we think it is the good starting point to have that. Having said that, for the Africa Group, as people say, the devil is in the detail. It is the share of public support that is there. Now the discussion is going about global investment goal. It means that we need to work with the private sectors. And if we have to do that under the UN, I don't think we need to do that on the UN Convention, because as a national government, you have skilled people to negotiate better deal with the private sectors. That's the first point. The second point is the global goal, the global investment goal that developed countries are referring to is actually a number that might exceed the 1.3 trillion, but this number includes all climate actions. And then you will soon realize that it is, 90% of those resources are being mobilized and invested in the North, while the mandate is clear. It is about resources from developed countries to developing countries.
Going back to something that you said earlier about, some things don't need to be at the discussed at COP. Governments have professionals who are adequately positioned to take some action. Now, taking that and moving it across to the people of Africa who are not at COP, you're negotiating for millions of people across the continent who aren't at COP. How can people not at COP help to make sure that this COP is a success for Africa?
I think you can use the virtual world to make pressure, to make Twitters and talk to the people. But I have to go.
And there you have it. Joining us very briefly before he had to run off to a negotiation, Alpha Kalonga, the lead negotiator on loss and damage for the Africa Group of Negotiators. And he managed to squeeze in there, just before he left, the call to action for us. So we may not be there physically, but there are a lot of platforms that we can engage on virtually. The UNFCCC pages on, and a lot of side events going on that we can engage with. And he said, please, let's use our virtual presence to apply pressure and make sure that COP29 is a win for Africa. Thank you so much for listening today. This was Sustain 267 on Yarona FM. Let's keep connected. You can follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter, at Sustain267. See you next week. Take care.
Sustain 267.